Today I want to talk a little bit about where we would be sitting if we were in the Academy, what we do with regard to what the ideas we can get from a museum are, if you like. And I want to bring together a couple of elements. And these are basic in some ways: instruments and what we get from them, and the music we choose to play on those instruments. We all spend every day near some kind of instrument, whether we are instrumentalists or singers or composers. We have tools that we use, and these tools are inspiring and they are practical at the same time. What I'd like to get us thinking a little bit about, and there's going to be a couple of things I'm going to ask you to do today, is what our relationships with those instruments are, and how do they also map onto our relationship with the music that we play. So the picture I've just put up there is one of my kind of everyday views. It's a very prosaic thing. It's simply the view of the tailpiece of one of my violins and the chin rest and the top of the instrument. At the risk of being very nerdy, what's particularly interesting about this is that this instrument, which dates from the end of the 1800s, a new instrument in some ways, it has the tailpiece, that's if you're not a string player, the wooden bit at the top, which was made for the instrument. So if you like, there is an aesthetic relationship between the tailpiece and the body of the instrument. It's not an attachment, it's the original. And the chin rest, which is on there, is not made for it. But I just want to observe something very prosaic, which is that there's clearly a relationship between the look of the instrument and the wear that happens to it. So the sort of flame on that tailpiece was not there, this thing here. Was not there when I first bought the instrument when I was 16. The instrument had not been played since it was made. And at that point, the instrument was around 80 years old, 85 years old. But that appeared basically as the result of my chin and eventually my stubble rubbing against the tailpiece for years and then decades. So part of the beauty of the instrument, if I can say that, has emerged from it being worn, from it being damaged. And as you can see, this instrument is not terribly clean. The tailpiece has got all kinds of disgusting gunk on it, if you like. So what I'd like to, if you like, raise the expectations of instruments a little bit to begin with. And I want to introduce this. I'm just going to... this is a extraordinary piece of paper and a recording, and I need to tell a story to begin with. In 1979, which was when I was turning 12, I was beginning to study with the great English violinist, Ralph Holmes, who would die aged 47 12 years later. And just before my first lessons with him, I was, of course, at that point, and I'm not anymore, an avid reader of violin magazines, and there used to be several, but obviously the Strad was the most obvious one and still is. And there was an announcement of an event that took place at the Royal Academy involving an instrument which is in the collection now. The instrument was being presented to the Academy by a lady known as Ilse Joseph. And the instrument is a Dalla Costa violin from 1762. And what I'm holding here is what's on the screen there. So I don't need to wave it around because there it is. I was very struck by what the Strad announced. The Strad announced that a pupil of Ralph Holmes, a young violinist at that point called Alison Kelly, had given a performance on the Dalla Costa violin, that's the one in front of you, to celebrate the instrument being given to the Academy. Now, it also said that Ilse Joseph had spent her life playing this instrument in memorial to her children who were victims of the Holocaust, and the instrument was being given to the Academy in that light, so the work could continue, if you like. And the very first performance, which was given at the Academy, given by Alison Kelly, was of Bruch's Kol Nidrei. And this is a very loaded way of beginning with this, but this instrument sits in the Academy collection at the moment, and I'm a little bit shocked to say that when I went to look at the catalogue entry, I found that it was marked simply with the details of the instrument and nothing of what you can clearly see even in front of you. Just a little potted history here. Ilse Joseph was born in Berlin and became a very successful chamber musician and soloist to degree, moved to Amsterdam just before the Second World War, where she married, and her children started going to school there, going to boarding school, to a Jewish boarding school in Amsterdam. And in 1940, she had separated from her husband and came to the UK. And in 1944, she learnt that the children that she had left in Holland with her husband had died. So I was going to if this is a very, very fraught way of beginning, but I want you to think a bit. If you were to find yourself with an instrument like this in your hands, what do you think it might bring with it? And what's interesting to me is that some of the people who have borrowed this instrument at the Academy, some of them have got interested in this and some of them have not. So let's just reiterate for those of you who've just come in, this violin which I'm talking about here, let's put the screen sharing back up again, is this beautiful Dalla Costa violin, and it's played by Ilse Joseph, whose children died in Auschwitz while she was in the UK. And then she spent the rest of her life raising funds for young people and children who'd been affected by the Holocaust. And she did it by the kind of thing you're looking in front of you. She made records like this, and when I actually started to do a little bit of research, I thought, let's do the obvious thing. Let's see if I can find one of these. It took me 25 seconds on eBay to find this. So I don't have the violin in my hand, but I've got the object in my hand. And I'm actually, and you can see the record cover has been signed, and I haven't brought myself to play it yet, but if I pull it out of the sleeve, you'll see it's a one-sided single. There's nothing on the other side. This is very much a home-produced thing. I think anybody can see that this is a precious object, and it's going to be very interesting for me when I bring this together with the violin, and then I know I'm starting at a very high or low point. What you choose to play on an instrument first, the first time you meet it, is fascinating. So I'd like to start there, and then I'm going to move to another response to an instrument. And then we're going to get a little bit more prosaic, and then I'm going to ask you to do something. Well, I will do when I found this. This face in front of you is the late American poet and writer Guy Gallo. If any of you are movie buffs, you might know that there is a John Huston film based on Doris Lessing's Under the Volcano. Guy wrote the script for that film when he was very, very young, began as a kind of superstar young screenwriter in Hollywood, but then moved to being a more thoughtful, scholarly writer, a poet, and he taught at Columbia University for many years. And I met him in 1995. I, at this point, was playing the violin, which is in front of you on the screen, and I've chosen another violin from the Academy collection. This is the 1734 Habeneck Stradivarius. This is an instrument which is also fraught with stories. If you like, the most prosaic of those stories is the fact that it was probably one of the very, very last instruments which the maker made. Antonio Stradivari made it, and it says inside, made in his 90th year. Stradivarius had a making career of over 70 years, which is extraordinary by any standards. The instrument is an extraordinary instrument. I mentioned earlier the British violinist Ralph Holmes. This was his instrument for many years, and then I was privileged to play it. But if you go back to the 19th century, and those of you who are conductors or composers or should know about this figure as well, anybody should, possibly the most influential musician in Paris in the second and third decades of the 19th century was a violinist, conductor, director, Francois-Antoine Habeneck. If you've read your Berlioz autobiography, you will remember Berlioz had a very complicated relationship with him, but Habeneck, amongst other things, directed the premiere of the Symphonie Fantastique, and he directed it from this violin. So this violin has been a witness to lots of history. And Guy and I were very close. Just to let you know, he died tragically young in his mid-50s 3 or 4 years ago. Very early in our conversations, we would spend a lot of time each summer together in New York. Early in our conversations, he revealed that he'd always wanted to play the violin when he was a child. And he told a really awful story, which was he begged his parents for a violin when he was 5 or 6, and there was a case wrapped up underneath the Christmas tree one year, and he delighted went to open it, and when he opened it, he'd found that they'd given him a plastic violin, and this basically ended any idea that he might have of being a violinist, and he was a great music lover, but obsessed with the idea that he'd been denied this. And the time he told me that story, which was in his apartment on the Upper East Side in New York City, I happened to be there with the violin, because what we would do is we'd spend long nights actually and talk all night and talk about writing, and then he would often make me play particularly Telemann, which he loved very deeply. Anyway, so he told me the story, and I said, "You mean you really wanted to play the violin?" He said yes. I said, "Did you ever touch one?" And he said no. So I got this violin out of the case and I put it into his hands. And so the very first notes he ever played on the violin were on this instrument. He immediately, I will let him describe it, because he wrote a short poem about it. So this is Guy Gallo writing about his first experience of playing any violin, which just happened to be this violin. He wrote, "I was not prepared. I expected terror, lineage bearing down to cramp my hand. Yes, I dropped it over and over. For a second imagined splinters about my feet. I didn't clutch, it wouldn't let me. Then it was there, lodged on collarbone, and so light as if Berlioz's ghost had taken some fraction of the weight. How long, I wondered, since this tender conglomeration of wood and physics had suffered so rank a beginner. Surely there was once a child, or a fat aristocrat, or an awkward curator. And now there was me. I played so badly, and still it thrilled even to my touch. Inviting, amused, clear-toned, smilingly unforgiving. And actually, that's actually really what happened. It was a small miracle. I think we're all used to the idea that the first thing that perhaps some of us will remember it. I started the violin too young, so I don't have a memory of this, of first sounds on an instrument being, particularly string instrument, scratchy noises. But actually the very first note that came out of the violin by some miracle was extremely beautiful, like the open strings, and he had an actually natural gift. At this point he was in his middle 40s, and he spent the rest of his life valiantly trying to play the violin, and became good enough to play some of the Baroque music which he loved so much. So those are two, if you like, not prosaic examples. And what I'd like everyone to do to start with is, this is where I'd like you to use the chat. I want to take 5 minutes, and whatever instrument you play, and if you're a composer, you might want to write about one of the instruments you use, which might not be a musical instrument. And effectively, I would like you to write into the chat 2 things about your instrument, or whatever you choose to write about. One thing would be about its materiality, something which you notice regularly or now about, it could be the way it looks or the way it feels. And the second thing would be something about something you associate with the instrument. And I don't want to control that too much. So, all right then, so let's just wait for other things to come in here. It was very striking how we began with Haydn's lovely observation of having a peg which doesn't match the others, and the fact that one of the interesting things about spending time with an instrument is that because we will spend more time, you'll spend more time with the instrument you're playing than anybody, including the person who made it. And that means that you will gradually, I mean, I love the fact that effectively there's almost a story attached to that peg. I put my hand into the jacket of my pocket yesterday, and I found a violin peg in it. And I don't know which instrument it's come from. There are far too many instruments in this house, so there's a bit of I'm rather worried about that. But on the other side of it is my wife, who's not a musician, finds violin pegs very lovely. So we have a number of Christmas decorations made from violin pegs hanging up with red string. But I also love this idea of the relationship of our instruments to our daily existence. She's just told a story which she didn't really make us clear, but we all realise the cellist has to make a decision which tube barrier they go from, because the cellist is bigger because of what they're carrying than anybody else. They're moving to Eliot's idea, a really beautiful thing, the feeling of what the finish on the back of the instrument feels like. It's interesting you brought that one up because I want to bring an instrument out. So most of you will be used to string instruments which have the kind of polish or French polish of an old violin, but this is a violin which the finish of which is of the back of the of the fingerboard has been done the way, I hope you can all see this, the way that the back of an electric guitar is done. This is an Australian Paul Davis Spur violin, electroacoustic violin or semi-acoustic violin model on a Magini model with basically the kind of laminate, the laminated feel you get on the back of an electric guitar. The interesting thing about this instrument is that it's got something of the feeling of an electric instrument. Also, you really do notice the kind of thing. I really love the thing you talked about there, the cold metal of the frets. We're just going through the material things for a moment. And then James, this brought together this idea, which is so important to us, the idea of the relationship between touch and resonance, and the very physical relationship we have with what we do. What's really, and then I love the thing about this idea of instruments which are reviving an older style of instrument. And what does that? This is with James Gilbert's clarinet. How does something which was to do with experimentation become our daily bread, if you like? Then we have the thing which I don't know if it's interesting. You've talked about breaking a baton, and Guy was talking about the idea of breaking an instrument. I'm one of the few people who's been in the awful position of holding a Strad when it actually sustained some damage, not because of me, but because there was a problem with how it had been repaired, and suddenly a hole appeared in the bottom of the instrument while I was playing it, and I could see into the instrument. I also love the idea that your beginning, from Otis's beginning here, begins with a playful relationship with conducting, that someone bought you a type of baton as a joke, and you're staying with the design of that because that's your beginning point. And then Lily talking about the temperature, which is interesting how much temperature is important to us. And as soon as I read what Lily wrote about cold, and we all recognize this, we talk about warming up, but actually very often with an instrument, the warming up of an instrument isn't actually a real thing. Whether it's to do with blowing through the instrument, or it being near us, or being in the room, or the other thing which is vital for nearly all of the instruments we use, friction. If you think of the multiple tons of, let's say, a pianist moves in the course of playing a Beethoven Hammerklavier, for instance, we know that everybody knows that one of the major places where friction is, if you like, it's where energy is spent in friction, is the production of heat. The piano heats up in the gears of the, not gears, the keys, everything. The piano itself will heat up just because it's being played and moved. And there's an interesting analogy that Lily has talked about, which I think we all know, maybe in our imaginations, the idea that warm sound is analogous to a warm instrument. That may or may not be the case. That's interesting. Ed he's talked about the fact he has a trumpet, which is a slightly unusual design, which means it's not entirely obvious how to hold it, which means that you had to find an interesting way to hold it to avoid getting a cramp in your hand. That's a really interesting point. So I know, for instance, that if I practice too long on the 1629 Amatio I usually use, the shape of the fingerboard means that I will get a little bit of cramp in my thumb. Whereas if I practice for a long time on, say, the earlier instrument, or even my 19th century instrument, that doesn't happen. And it's only a tiny amount, probably 0.5 millimeter difference, but it has a profound impact over time. Interesting at oboist, you get to look at all the complexity of the silverwork on the oboe. And of course, the interesting thing is that the oboist is looking at the silverwork in at an angle, looking through it. And look at what Eleanor has written there, the idea that you get distracted by admiring the instrument while you're practicing it. Perhaps that's not really distraction. It could be one of the functions of the beauty of the mechanism of an instrument is to inspire you. And of course, then she's moved to the thing which all of us can point to the physical damage from playing the instrument. So she's talking about her oboe thumb, which is going to be there. I have a violin thumb there, so violinists have a callus there. And if you don't use a shoulder rest or chin rest like I don't, it means I've actually got a hole in my just in the bone here. So that's effectively interesting that you've actually decided you like the oboe lumps, so it's actually a kind of sign of hard work. So you've chosen not to get a thumb plate grip. That's a kind of heroism. Then Rio has moved to the fact that there is the patterns on the instrument, and of course those are to do with the wood which is chosen to make the instrument are symmetrical. Sounds to me like we're talking about a violin which has got a two-piece back. I'll show you one. Like this, which is this is a 16th century instrument with a two-piece back, which means that it's a split piece of wood like that. And then Rio's talking about the difference in the material quality of the instrument according to the weather. A violin, for some violins, is a little bit like hanging a piece of seaweed up. It will get damp when the weather is going to rain. And is that lovely, the fact you've started to talk about this? All of us know the smell of our instruments, whether or not we are wind players. Violinists in particular, if we go into a pine forest, have this amazing recognition because we have nostrils and lungs completely filled with rosin. So when a violinist sneezes, this is information you don't necessarily want, a violinist sneezing smells like pine sap to the violinist. Yeah, it's very nice to see Kawai is talking about choosing a very particular keyboard, and I just love the fact you like that you've you know you're going to have to spend a lot of time looking at that. You've chosen something which is aesthetically pleasing to you, and also look at that lovely thing, the coffee-fueled nights of composing to deadline, that you have this real association of the instrument to your life. That's fantastic. Elizabeth is writing about the fact that if you have an instrument for any long period of time, the look of the instrument will be partially due to things you've done to it. So the instrument I showed you at the beginning, which is a 1899-1900 Lagenet, a Hill violin, I'm the only person who's ever played that instrument. So every mark on the instrument is one I've put it, like you've talked about it. Imagine what that's going to be like in 20, 30 years' time. And it's really good that, of course, yes, we look after our instruments as much as we can, but I love the fact that Elizabeth has talked about the fact that there is not a satisfaction, but there's an association which goes to the fact that we mark our instruments as we develop with them. And it's very clear that for Elizabeth, this instrument particularly was absolutely part of her decision to become a musician. It's interesting, worth note that discrepancy on viola sizes was not confined to violas in the beginning. And if I just show you if you see the crazy scroll of this violin, you can see that standard sizes is only something which emerged really in the past 200 years ago. Stephen has talked about the fact that his trombone, after 2 years of playing, that the inner slide is slightly bent. It started to map itself onto the arc of his instrument. It's interesting that I love that. Presumably the memory of struggling to reach sixth position was when you are remembering when the instrument was slightly too large for you. So the association of the instrument will also bring together with us associations of being younger, if you like. So everything that you have all written about is, for me, is fundamental to our relationship with music itself. And if I just go back now to the screen sharing, I'm going to talk through a few things here. So we've been talking about the nicks and damages. So that's the front of the instrument I'm holding here, this a incredibly old Brescian instrument, which is almost nothing but the damages and the repairs which have happened over its nearly 500 years of life. These are very much part of its quality, if you like. I wanted to show you this picture. This is the great Norwegian sculptor and painter Jan Groth. I took this picture in Oslo a few years ago, and this was actually the very first time we met. We did a very big project based in Norway and the US, where I wrote and performed music linked to his painting and sculpture. He's probably the most celebrated artist living in Norway today. And when I met him, I did something I would never normally do, which was I immediately handed him the Amati to hold. And my wife just couldn't believe it, because I won't let her hold it. I wanted to see the hands of this extraordinarily sensitive, refined-minded, a man whose hands are so attuned to touch and the concentration of touch. And this is one of the most moving moments I know, of watching this man in his mid-80s who loved music, feeling his way around the instrument. I learned a huge amount about the instrument from watching him hold it. Almost the view of the Marti violin from when I play it, a little bit low. I love the fact that we are gifted views of our instruments which are far more intimate than anybody watching us play ever gets. And I completely agree that, and I think this is fundamental, a lot of what we do on the instruments is related to, I think, the extraordinary pleasure. It doesn't matter what violin or oboe or trombone or piano, and yes, baton or computed keyboard. What makes these things beautiful is the fact that they are perfectly suited to their purpose, and the combination of the classical form with the refinement of something which works perfectly is aesthetically, I think, very inspiring. You might remember that when I started, I told a story about an instrument which is no more. I just wanted to show you this, because in the context of all this kind of outpouring of affection for our instruments, I just wanted to show you these pictures. Up the top right, this was the very first time I or any other living violinist in the late 20th century held a 1647 Niccolo Amati violin, which had been owned by the great Norwegian violinist Ola Bull in the 19th century. The reason I found out about it was I'd started researching Ola Bull's work in Norway and America, and I was blogging about his work and about this missing violin. Just to get this into context, if you go to Bergen in Norway, you'll find that his Gaspar da Salo violin is the centerpiece of the which is their equivalent to the Victoria and Albert Museum there. He's probably the most important Norwegian of the 19th century. But this instrument had disappeared in about 1910. I knew it had gone into a bank for various reasons. And I was contacted by the owner when I started writing about it to say, well, would I like to see it? And so it was conveyed to me after we met. And this was the first time I held it. And I'm going to say the words, it was possibly the most perfect condition Amati in existence. And this is the instrument which I told you about, which was burnt to a cinder in a house fire in the States at the beginning of this year. I was able to work on it for 2 or 3 years, and then it went back to the owner, and nobody quite knows why, but the house burnt down earlier this year. So this is an instrument which doesn't exist anymore. But I can still, thinking about all the things that you have all been talking about, I remember every nick and mark on that instrument. I was lucky enough to record on it and travel with it and in various countries. And everything you've all been talking about its feeling in the hand, its smell, its sound, it's very, very much still with me. And that's something I wanted to just convey, is I think that these things that we get from our instruments are fundamental to the way we approach music, and they're not fragile. Ideas and memories are not fragile in the way that material things tend to be. Then we've been talking about damage, but I just wanted to put this picture here because another form of damage, if you like. These are two sister or brother Stradivarius violins, both of them in the Metropolitan Museum in New York City. I took this picture in December when I was giving a concert on two of them. The one, interestingly, the one on the top is the one which has had the most alterations made to it. The lower instrument, as you can see, is in what we call modern setup. That is, it was converted in the 19th century. The tailpiece you can see there is a 20th century tailpiece. It's a 19th century model. The fingerboard is 19th century, and the bridge is a modern 20th century bridge, and there's my chin rest sitting on it. The violin at the back, which you can see is in Baroque form, was converted back to Baroque form in the 1970s, which means at some point in the 19th century, it was turned into a modern violin. And then sometime in the 20th century, the 1970s, that was ripped out and it was taken back to what the 1970s thought a Baroque violin should look like. In many ways, we don't think they should look like this anymore. So that in itself is already a kind of historical curiosity. And I think it's worth noting, despite the fact that these two instruments are fundamentally the same instrument, they were made from the same piece of wood. And apart from the different wear patterns on them, you can see the ribs are from the same piece of wood. But even apart from the sound, the difference, that the different aesthetics of the fittings, but also going back to what at least two of you have talked about with regard to temperature. The instrument on the top, with the exception of the covered G-string, has no metal on it at all. It's wood and animal intestine with the covered G-string. The instrument on the bottom has metal covered strings and a wire string, a metal adjuster, and metal attachments on the chin rest, which of course, quite apart from anything else, is something none of you have actually mentioned, but it's worth saying. It fundamentally affects the weight of the instrument, as well, of course, the way it resonates. This is another example of a freighted instrument, if you like. And this picture was taken a few years ago when I was playing this instrument in the Library of Congress in the Coolidge Auditorium there. And this is Fritz Kreisler's Del Gesù from 1730. This was his instrument for life. What I'm actually playing on there is I'm playing a second inversion C major chord, which produces a low C overtone. And I work with a wonderful American photographer, Richard Bram, who I don't mind getting very close to me when we do things. And he's acutely sensitive to this kind of thing. But then I want to get back to this aesthetic question and show you these three things, because I do think this also fits nicely with what some of you have been talking about. And that's the question of symmetry, irregularity, and form. So Rio mentioned the non-symmetrical nature of the wood of the instrument, which of course all our instruments have a relationship between the natural form of the materials and the classical form, I'm going to use that word, of the architecture they're built into. But I wanted to show you this. This is not progress. This is literally two aesthetic differences down the road. Both the instruments in the middle on the left, were both made in Brescia, admittedly 40, 50 years away from each other. And the one on the right, that's the top of the Ola Bola Marti there, was made down the road in Cremona. And whilst they both refer back to the same thing, which is, well, do they? They refer back, if you look at the one on the right, there's an explicit reference to the top of an Ionic column in architecture. But if you begin on the left, you can see that the very form of that column comes from, say, the way that a fern frond unfurls itself. And what's fascinating as the makers interact with the materials is, do they set the materials in a completely classical form? If you like, do they allow the quality of the material to be revealed through being set in a pure mathematical environment, a Euclidean environment, or do the materials themselves just define the form, as is so clearly happening with the Maggini violin in the middle and the anonymous Brescian on the left. I think it's a really fascinating question, a fascinating problem. And I'm thinking still about the way we look at our instruments. This as another view. If you think all of us, our point of view from our instruments is different, even a conductor's point of view, profoundly different from the audience and the listeners. And what fascinates me about this violin, this Thomas Smith violin, let me just get it. So this violin was made in Piccadilly in 1750, just round about the time that Piccadilly was becoming the fashionable place to live, by the great British maker Thomas Smith. This is the epitome of a great English violin. But what's amazing about it was Thomas Smith was friends with the second and most famous architectural woodcarver in the UK. The first, obviously, from the previous century was Grimley and Gibbons, but this was a man called John Boson. And if any of you have spent any time in the Royal Naval Chapel in Greenwich, and if you go to the altar there, you'll find that Boson carved the altar with a whole series of these heads, which are actually, although it looks rather female here, is the head of the Apollo Belvedere. There it is. But what's fascinating for me, if you look at this so explicitly architectural here, is the view of the instrument, as I've shown in the picture, when you view it from there, and the view of the face suddenly is most extraordinary, because suddenly we get, let me go back, that. And there's no question to me that Boson had given a lot of thought as to what that was going to look like from my point of view, or the point of view of whomever was lucky enough to play the instrument. But just go back to that question, which is the kind of fundamental question of standardization, which a couple of you have sort of hinted at. I do think it's interesting that with almost all instruments, it doesn't matter whether they're conductor batons or even computers or horns or oboes, what's fascinating is we get quite used to the idea that instruments should have one standard size and one standard shape. These are two lineups of instruments preparing for concerts recently. On the left-hand side, everything that you are looking at there would have been called violins when they were made. The violin nearest you was made for the orchestra of Charles II, and it's got his crest on the back, and you can't see it clearly there, but it's dated 1664, and it's quite a small instrument. The next one along is Cremona, made 40 years earlier, has a 350mm back, which is kind of standard now, but there was nothing standard about it then. The instrument behind it, with a crisscross baton on the back of it, did not begin its life as a violin or a violin family instrument at all. It began its life as a bass viol, and then some point at the end of the 18th century, it was cut down by the Scottish maker Hardy, the greatest Scottish violin maker, who retained the decoration and turned it into a very small viola. But the huge instrument behind, which was made in London in 1700 by possibly the greatest British maker, Baruch Norman, is an enormous tenor violin, much bigger than any viola you'll ever see. And it's so big that it has a kind of cutaway to enable the player to get it under their chin. And as you can see, I've already waved this kind of modern extension of this. Interestingly, thinking about one of you was just talking about, a couple of you have been talking about wind instrument design. I think the wind players and brass players, and perhaps even pianists, are more aware of the fact that what goes along with instrument design is a degree of redundancy, things becoming, well, failures, if you like. And these objects are very much part of that. These are a group of automatic mutes which were made in Denmark in the mid-1920s. I found out about them. There's a quick story. You could see there they are on the left, and you could see one of them mounted on one of my violins on the right. And the reason I found out about this was if you go and look at the manuscript of Carl Nielsen's last work for violin, which is one of his 2 pieces for violin alone, on the front page of the music, it says, in Nielsen's handwriting, it says, in order to find the mute necessary to play this piece, you need to go to the shop of the certain shop in Denmark. And this violin shop, up till the 1990s, was Europe's longest father to son violin business, going back to 1750. The firm of Hirt and Son. And I'd been in there before, but I walked in and I said, I had the copy of the Nielsen with me. And I said, look, it says this here. This was in 1925, which would have been when the owner's, Emil Hirt's grandfather, was running the shop. And I said, could you sell the mute? He said, you're the first person ever to come in and ask for it. Interestingly, despite the fact the composer had asked for it on the music, nobody had ever asked for this particular mute, which is an automatic mute, which goes onto the back of the bridge underneath and can be flicked on just with a little finger very quickly. Tragically, the firm closed down a few years later, and so they sent me all the remaining mutes that they have. These are the last 4 which exist. So this is an interesting question for all of us. And if you think about the keys on the front of an oboe, if you look carefully on an oboe keying, unless you're looking at a Howarth Redgate oboe, you'll see there's lots of like vestigial remnants there, just like we still have an appendix. A lot of the construction of an instrument bears the remnants of its past. So what I wanted to bring to all of this was this engagement with the instrument, and I want to now take it to another side, if you like. A lot of the way you've all been thinking and talking is very similar to the way that we use things in a museum. Let's put this violin down, it's bothering me. What's really interesting is if I flick back through all the things you have all written, is that you've all gone backwards and forwards from I like the idea, really prosaic things, through to stories, through to history, personal history. That's really important to notate, if you like, your personal history with the instrument. This means that you're immediately gifted an idea of how to work with an object, say, that you meet for the first time, because you have that relationship already. And museums are, I think, rather wonderful, because a really, really good museum, if you can forget some of the kind of immersive ideas, which I think are becoming less fashionable again now, or an immersive experience to a degree doesn't invite the imagination so much as supplants the imagination. What's fantastic about walking into a museum is that it allows space for your imagination, even when you're confronted with the thing that you're coming to see, because it doesn't tell you what your experience is. So, for instance, when you go to the Galleria Reina Sofia in Madrid, where there's this amazing room where they have Picasso's Guernica, they've arranged the rooms so that you don't see the picture until you're standing right in the middle. So you walk into this blank room, and when you get to the middle of the room, there's a slot in the left-hand wall, and that's the place where you can stand, and you can go through there. Then you see the whole of the Picasso at once. You don't see it from the side for the first time, which is really interesting in itself. It's quite controlling, but effectively, by controlling your point of view, it means the first experience you have of the thing is a complete experience, if you can call it a complete experience, and then you start to investigate it. And what I wanted to kind of bring this to is to ask you all one more thing, which is, I don't want you to write this down, but to have a think about this, which is the way that you choose the music you're going to study and explore, the way you choose to do it, the way you'd like to choose to do it in the future, in as much as if you think of all the combinations of all the music you could be playing, are you choosing it, making your trip through, I don't like the word repertoire, I'm going to use it, through the choices of music you could play? Are you making that trip the way you'd like to, or are exterior forces defining that? That's the first thing. And the second thing is to ask, if you use the model you've all provided from your relationship to the tools you use to be artists, how does this project onto your relationship with the materials themselves, i.e. the music itself? There are a number of people here who are composers, and it's interesting, to a greater or lesser degree, composers enter their own music through the imagination or not through their imagination. There are some composers who I know would never tell a story about their music, and there are some for whom the discovery of the story behind the music is everything. I'm in the middle of working with one composer. We've been working for 5 months now on a very large, not narrative, but a dramatic piece for violin with large ensemble based on Geoffrey of Monmouth's Prophecies of Merlin. And so, to a degree, there is a big story. There's a lot of words behind the music, but gradually, as we spend more and more time working on this, the story itself is beginning to recede into the distance. And, we're not entirely sure whether the audience or any future player needs or doesn't need to know that story. And I think this is related to the relationship we have physically and imaginatively to the instruments we have. So, for instance, if I think about, I can see I've got Lily's note up here. There's always a big debate in the academy as to whether or not anybody should be allowed to touch or play the horn which was owned by Dennis Brain. Not only was this horn owned by the player, who many horn players would regard as one of the greatest players ever to touch the instrument, and certainly one of the most inspiring of players, but this instrument was also, and this takes me back to where I began to a degree with the tragedy of the instrument of Ilse Joseph with her children. That instrument was in the car when Dennis Brain was killed, and the instrument itself was extremely badly damaged in that car crash and was reconstructed afterwards. So we have a situation that this instrument has not only been a witness to history, this instrument itself has been recovered from history. So it means that it's, I would imagine any horn player picking that up would find themselves, I would certainly find myself rather nervous about that. And I'm not entirely sure where that would come from. And I think it's something to do with an odd relationship between the, if you like, the fantastic and the practical, which was why I wanted to read you the poem from Guy Gallo. In which case, let's just give everybody, rather than confront you all with this now, let's do a little bit of a task. What would be great is if all of you could, if you didn't put anything in the chat, or you did, have a look at one of the things in the chat and send me by email a response to something from it. Because if I just go through what we have there, we've got this quotidian thing, the fact that we spend all of this time with these extraordinary things. That, if you think how that models onto the choice of music we play. So the fact is, for many of us, the music we explore most regularly is often the greatest. The next thing is the association with our personal history. Eliot talked about communal music making, the sharing of music, and how does instruments fit into that. He's talked about the association of the guitar with that. But then I think that's very exciting to think about how that fits with the music we play. I think it's often, for instance, take singing. It often tends to be forgotten, for instance, that Schubert Lieder were not designed to be sung in rarefied concerts with everybody singing with programs. They were designed to be sung in very communal events, often alternating with people singing together. Then this beautiful thing that James wrote here about the idea of the relationship of, I'm going to turn his words upside down to a degree, of the meditative relationship that we all, I think, will experience very regularly with sound and resonance. The fact that in some ways the greatest music we ever play is when there's no music at all, where it's simply sound, or even the silence. Imagine that we've all encountered it, the silence in an extraordinary landscape, for instance. So I'm going to ask you to do that and send me, each of you send me a sentence about this question of how you choose and relate to the music you choose. And that's where I want to just walk us through some museum things to finish with. In fact, I'm going to go backwards. This is not in a museum. This is in St Botolph's Aldgate, and this is possibly the earliest surviving carving by Grinling Gibbons of apparently crudely rendered picture of a violin, but the reason is because it was designed to be on an organ plate high above the ground from 1674 there. To back up to here. I wanted to put this up here. I think that the experience of going into a museum is fantastic just because it relates to the way that we work with a piece of art, whether it's an instrument or a piece of music. This I took at the world's most northerly museum in Longyearbyen in Svalbard. I was doing a project there a couple of years ago, and these are all the young teenagers who live on the island, exploring this tiny, tiny gallery. And what's really interesting about it is we've all experienced it, is whether you're with a child or whether you're with each other, sometimes the ideas which are associated with a piece of art simply happen because we're near them or we're next to them. It doesn't even matter whether those children were looking at the pictures or not. In fact, I was working on the other side of the room and they came over and asked me what I was doing, and I was composing lying on the floor. And some of them wanted to talk about the music, and the group of three girls standing there on the right stood next to me and they played the game rock, paper, scissors while I was composing, which was one of the most inspired things I'd ever seen anybody do in an art gallery, and really helped me with what I was doing. Then there's the question of are we simply inspired by the contents of the space, the things in the space, to do something else? This is a project in the Enlightenment Gallery of the British Museum. That's David Gorton's head underneath whichever playwright that is there, and that's Julian Perkins playing the harpsichord. But I wanted to kind of wind it up with this. I took this picture in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. Last summer. I was supposed to be doing a project with them this year, but of course that's been postponed. And this stands in one of the kind of indoor courtyards of the museum. And it's by the great sculptor Le Gros, the late sort of kind of made round about the same time that composers like Marat and Marais were working in Versailles. And it struck me, and I brought this up, that not only was this a sculpture of a musical instrument, but it was a sculpture which had actually been designed to work as a musical instrument. As you can see, it has pegs and has the remains of strings there. It has a sound box. It's hollow. And it was designed so that when water came through the fountain and struck the box and struck the strings, it played notes. Effectively, it's a water Aeolian harp. And if anybody of you have read or know about Simon Schama's work, about 25 years ago, he wrote a book called Landscape and Imagination. And in it, he wrote a chapter about late Renaissance and Baroque gardens and talked about the fact that these were not silent places, that fountains and gardens were loud, noisy, musical places full of either surprises or, in the case of this, fountains which played music. That's a fountain which is designed to look like a musical instrument, which actually is a musical instrument. Eliot's given us a really good kind of envoi. Is anyone here an organist? I wonder how everything we've talked to would relate to instruments which belong to other buildings and normally associated with the professional post and lifestyle of regular worship, music for worship. Can I just say that something oblique to that? Until comparatively recently, and well into the 19th century, the majority of instruments that were made were not made to be carried around, but made to be played in a specific place, in a specific building. So if you think about an organ being made for a specific space and that acoustic, that is analogous to the fact that if you go join the Vienna Philharmonic Orchestra as a string player, you'll be handed the violin, which for the past 150, 200 years has been associated with the stand on which you play. You don't take that violin home. It hangs in its own special box behind the Musikverein. It is specifically built to function with the orchestra in that building. And of course, it's worth remembering that the very word orchestra doesn't define the players, it defines the very specific space in the Greek theatres where the players sat. And if you go back and you read your Vitruvius, the 10 books of architecture, Vitruvius talks in great length about how buildings, particularly theatres, should be designed to function as musical instruments. He talks about how the Greeks and later the Romans inserted, and he was commissioned to write this book by Julius Caesar, of course, inserted specifically sized terracotta pots underneath the seats in the theatres, which meant that the actors knew that if they faced certain ways in the building, different vowels and consonants would ring in different ways. And of course, all Greek theatre was always absolutely surrounded, and it was music. So this was music being made on instruments inside a building itself, which was and is an instrument. And as anybody who's ever seen any of those amazing pictures taken with very small cameras inside musical instruments knows, the moment you get inside an instrument, it of course is a building. So Eliot's question is a really a great one.